Hi stakeholders, it's good to be here with you today, presenting on the topic of exploring meat consumption around the world. So let's get started. So first I'm going to tell you a little bit about the data set I worked with. It was a combination of life expectancy data from the United Nations, as well as global meat consumption data from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. So the life expectancy data is presented as life expectancy at birth in years, and the meat consumption data is given as kilograms consumed per capita in a year. The meat consumption data is divided into four categories of sheep, beef, poultry, and pig. So the two data sets that I worked with included data from the years 1990 to 2017 for 43 different countries. Right. So the life expectancy data that we're working with is very representative. As you can see in this chart, the Human Development Index, which is an index by the United Nations, rank for these countries ranks from um, the most developed countries in the world to the least developed countries. Also, by looking at this chart, you can see that there is a very strong negative correlation between life expectancy and human development. Okay, so the use case. So uh, I was trying to see if there's a link between meat consumption and life expectancy first, and secondly, I was trying to see if it is possible to distinguish different geographic regions by looking at their patterns of meat consumption. All right, so the results. First off, just by plotting, you can see that meat consumption correlates positively with life expectancy. As you'd expect, as people that eating meat helps people live longer, and also people who have more disposable income or more income in general could afford to eat more meat. So there is definitely not unexpected to see a positive correlation. As you can see, that correlation is flattening out quite a bit as life expectancy gets above 70 years old. But as you'll see, even though it flattens, you don't see it decreasing anywhere. So no evidence that life expectancy is decreasing because of eating too much meat, per se. So then I looked at, I just took that data and only took the points where life expectancy was greater than or equal to 75. Here you can see the positive correlation is almost non-existent, almost a flat, no correlation. So we kind of see two clusters in this data, one that's 78 and below life expectancy and one that's 80 and above life expectancy. Um, as it turns out, the countries in the top clusters are some of the most developed countries in the world, like top 10, top 20 on Human Development Index. And while the ones that are in the bottom cluster are not. So as you can see, um, yeah, there are some countries that eat a lot of meat, and they also have a very high life expectancy, and that seems to relate to being some of the most developed countries in the world. But as you can see, it's still a slightly positive correlation, no negative correlation. Okay, so then if we could establish that eating meat seems to be associated with higher life expectancy, maybe if we split meat up into categories, we'd see different results. So let's check that out. Okay, sheep data is kind of tough to work with because it's just not eaten in high quantities, but looking at this data, you can see there's no correlation between sheep consumption and life expectancy. Pig has a strong positive correlation, as you can see, which might be surprising considering it's a very fatty cut of meat, but yeah, fairly strong correlation regardless. Beef has a positive correlation, sort of flattens out faster than pig does, but still a positive correlation. And poultry also shows a very strong correlation, positive correlation between poultry consumption and life expectancy. So as you can see, even when splitting up between different kinds of meat, there's no change in our result. So the conclusion is, although there are confounding variables, meat consumption is associated with higher wealth, better health care, and better quality of life, there seems to be no evidence that eating more meat leads to shorter life expectancy. So it's not conclusive. Like I said, there's confounding variables, but based on what I've seen, I could definitely not say that eating meat could lower your life expectancy. Okay, so for the next part, I used some machine learning um, modeling on this data. So yeah, will utilizing machine learning give us new insights? So the first type of machine learning model I made is called a linear regression model. So a linear regression tries to draw a straight line that will kind of fit through all the data points and show a trend. I created this linear regression model to predict life expectancies in the country when the model is fed information of meat consumption, some geographic data, and development status data. And so my results of the linear regression were that the model had an average root mean squared error of 4.67. So what this means is that my model was about 5 years off on average on its predictions. So for something like life expectancy, a difference between a life expectancy of 75 and 70 is very significant. So I consider that this model did not do a very good job. So what this indicates to me is that it is hard to predict life expectancy simply by using meat consumption data and even some other key geographic indicators. It's really much more complicated than that. All right, so for the second model I made was to see if I could predict the region a country was in, geographic region, based on its food consumption pattern. So my data was divided into 5 regions: Africa, the Americas, Asia, Europe, and Oceania. And so I created a decision tree classifier to predict the region based on the meat consumption. Now, while for my, to this point, I was just using raw kilograms per capita meat consumption numbers. For this model, I tried a different approach of instead using proportions, like what proportion of total meat consumption was, say, poultry or beef for a country. I thought by doing it this way, I would kind of put rich and poor countries on an equal footing. So while one country might eat a lot less than the other country overall, the kind of proportion of different meats might be similar to a richer country. All right, so my results. My classifier had an F1 score of 0.9. The highest possible F1 score is 1.0, so 0.9 is a nearly perfect score. This F1 score means that my classifier was extremely good at classifying countries to the correct regions, the correct geographic region they were in. And what this result shows is that geographic regions are very much distinguishable by having unique meat consumption patterns. Like if you live in Africa or Asia, the proportions of what meats constitute your meat consumption are going to be very different. All right, and finally, I created an online application. So this online applications let anyone interact with that classification model I made. So what my online application does is that it will guess what geographic region you live in when you tell it your meat consumption pattern. And you can try out my application at the website below. So thank you so much for listening, shareholders, and I hope I brought you information that will be useful to you. All right, thank you.